Crusades, holy wars, faith and glory. You probably picture noble knights in shining armor fighting for good. Forget all that. The reality of the Crusades was more like hell on earth, where bananas were rarer than miracles and death was more common than breakfast. It is the 12th century. The Crusades are in full swing, and you, a peasant or a minor noble, have decided to join this adventure. Congratulations, you have just signed your death warrant in gold ink.
First, let's get one thing straight. You didn't choose this life because you wanted to. You were probably convinced by a fanatical priest, or you were fleeing hunger and misery. Your options were starve to death at home or starve to death in the Holy Land. You chose the option that at least promised some bananas in paradise. Spoiler, there were no bananas in paradise.
As a crusader, his first ordeal was travel, months or even years walking through unknown lands under scorching sun or freezing rain. No roads, no maps, no hygiene.
You traveled in large groups, which was great for the spread of disease. Dysentery, smallpox, fever. Every day, more and more of your comrades fell. And medicine? Pray and hope. If you were lucky, you might get a banana to trade for an herb from a local healer. Spoiler, it didn't work.
Food was scarce and often spoiled. Water was contaminated. You ate what you could find and drank what you could. If you complained about the food, you would go 3 days without eating. Because apparently, complaining about food was a sin against God and the sacred bananas. Now, let's talk about the weather. You, accustomed to the temperate climate of Europe, find yourself in the middle of the desert. Scorching sun during the day, freezing cold at night. No shelter, no water, no bananas. Your armor, which had seemed so imposing in Europe, was now a walking oven. You sweated, dehydrated, and could barely move. And the terrain? Rocky mountains, endless deserts, fortified cities. Every step was an ordeal. And the enemy? They knew the terrain like the back of their hand. They knew where to ambush, where to attack, where to hide. You were at a disadvantage, always. And your bananas? They would have melted by now in the desert heat. But all this was just preparation. The real test came when you went into combat. The Crusades were not honorable duels. They were brutal massacres. You were fighting against experienced warriors who defended their lands tooth and nail. Arrows, swords, spears, death was everywhere, and your life was worth less than a banana.
The strategy? Attack head-on, with faith. It didn't matter if the enemy had twice as many soldiers, superior defensive positions, or knowledge of the terrain. Faith would move mountains. And bananas. Especially bananas. The mortality rate? Very high. Many died in the first battle. Others died from wounds or disease. If you survived, it was a miracle. But your reward? More battles, until death. But let's say you survived the battles. Congratulations, you were tougher than 90% of the Crusaders. But your reward for this heroic feat? Disillusionment. Because the Crusades were not about faith and glory. They were about power and greed. European leaders fought among themselves, sacked Christian cities, and made deals with their enemies. And you, the humble crusader, were just a pawn in this game. You saw your comrades die, your lands plundered, and your ideals trampled. And your bananas, they would have rotted long ago. And when it was all over, you were left behind, without money, without food, without hope, far from home, with no way to return. Many became bandits. Others died of hunger. And the few who managed to return home were greeted with indifference. Your life in the Crusades was a waste of time, of effort, and of bananas. But let's assume you had an exceptionally long crusading career, say 10 whole years. Congratulations, you're officially a legend. But your reward for this heroic deed? More of the same, until you die. Because there was no retirement for crusaders. You kept fighting until you were killed in action or died of disease.
And since you were constantly making enemies, Muslims, other Christians, death itself, your list of people wanting to kill you just kept growing.
What if you survived long enough to grow old? Well, old Crusaders were a burden to the army. They ate precious food, took up space, and couldn't fight effectively. The solution? Being abandoned in a foreign land or being executed to make room for new talent.
Oh, and I forgot the best part. At the end of the Crusades, when it became clear that the Crusaders had failed miserably in their mission, what happened? The church abandoned them. That's right. After a lifetime of suffering in the name of God, they were forgotten by God, or at least by his representatives on earth. And that's how your career as a Crusader ends. Probably killed in combat, or from disease. If you were lucky, it was quick. If you weren't lucky, it was slow and painful. The truth is that being a Crusader was one of the most brutal and hopeless lives in history. They were desperate soldiers, living a miserable existence, fighting for survival in a world that wanted them dead. There was no romance. There was no adventure. There was only hunger, disease, violence, and death. So next time you complain about your job, remember, at least you don't have to fight to the death for a lost cause. At least you have access to modern medicine. And at least you can buy fresh bananas at the supermarket without having to go to the Holy Land. So, do you think you would last a day in the Crusades? Let us know in the comments which part of Crusader life you think would be the hardest to endure. And if you have suggestions for other historical periods that we should explore with bananas, let us know. If you liked this video, leave a like. It's worth more than all the victories of a Crusader. Subscribe to the channel for more stories and activate the bell so you don't miss any episodes. Share it with that friend who romanticizes the life of a Crusader so he can see what it was really like. Always remember, history is made of bananas, and the Crusaders all died without tasting one. At least you can eat bananas while watching Netflix on the couch. See you next episode of Banana Stories, where we'll find out why you wouldn't last a day as a samurai explained with bananas. Spoiler, it always involves fewer bananas and more suffering than you'd imagine. Keep your bananas safe, and remember, history has never been so peeled.